You are watching Notepad. I'm your host Ibrahim Sani. This is Budget Week. We have with us in the studio Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar, the chairman of Bursa Malaysia, talking about the budget and what he thinks is going to be impactful towards the Malaysian economy. Very recently, on 6th November, the Finance Minister, Senator Tangku Datuk Sri Zafrul Abdul Aziz, presented a 322 billion ringgit budget. And of course, bringing about three main goals, one of which is to bring about well-being of the people. The second is, of course, to ensure business continuity, and the third is economic resilience. Tan Sri Wahid, what are your initial thoughts on the budget? We've seen how the debates have gone for the past 3 or 4 days in the Parliament right now. Some early thoughts on the budget.
Well, thank you, Ibrahim, for having me here this afternoon. I must say that the budget has been a tough one for any finance minister in this environment. And naturally, the figure of 322.5 billion ringgit, that's the biggest ever and very expansionary. And that's appropriate given the priorities, the three that you mentioned about making sure the well-being of the rakyat is taken care of, business continuity and economic resilience. So I guess it's not an easy, very difficult to please everyone, but something that has got to be presented and I think appropriate.
I think based on the commentators that we've had on the show so far, they were talking about the possibility of this budget still being approved, but there are still a lot of conversations into some of the assumptions that were made into the budget, one of which is the income. We're talking about a tax income assumption of 10% higher than the year before. Do you feel that these kind of nitty-gritty things are going to be debated by the parliamentarians, and the assumptions are going to be continued to be tested over the time that we're going to have this budget debate in Parliament?
Yeah, I think to me a lot of the debate has been about allocation rather than how much revenue can be collected and so on. My view is actually, coming from an accountant, you have certain bases and assumptions in respect of how much revenue you can collect and all. And naturally, like any other budget at the corporate level, you have the opportunity to review it midstream, take into account the events as they unfold. As we all know, this pandemic that we are going through is unprecedented. It's almost impossible to predict with certain level of accuracy. So you always have to make assumptions based on the facts that you know currently and get on with it. And when the time comes, if your assumptions are wrong, you have to make the necessary adjustments as you go along.
Yeah, the biggest challenges that the government is doing right now is, of course, navigating through an unprecedented time, yes, as you alluded to earlier. And because of unprecedented time, it does bring about unprecedented measures. Situations like allowing EPF members or KWSP members to allow themselves to be withdrawn from the account one. I mean, the whole idea of having account one is sacrosanct. That's something that we should, cherish and treasure and hold until we hit an age. What is your personal view on this in terms of, these unprecedented measures, such as dipping your little fingers into account one?
Yeah, I must say I'm actually with the people at EPF in terms of the need to make sure that we have adequate savings for our retirees. And based on current statistics, majority of them had less than 50,000 ringgit, and that's not a lot given the life expectancy at around 77 years for female and 73 for male. And so that means that between the age of 60 and 75, so you have a good 15-20 years to live, and with 50,000 under most circumstances it is not adequate. We are fortunate that we have this extended family concept where typically children will look after their parents and so on. But as we progress, that dynamics may change. So I think the idea would be, in an ideal situation, you wouldn't want to touch that retirement savings until the time comes. But having said that, I think it is important for us to take into account that some people, they have more pressing needs today. And it's about survival today rather than for tomorrow. And I think this is where perhaps an ideal middle solution has arrived in the form of allowing people who are affected by this pandemic to withdraw not one lump sum, but 500 ringgit a month over the next 12 months, so that you can help them live for the next 1 year until things recover.
Yeah, very difficult dilemma to go through.
Indeed.
But let's take a look into some of the Rakyat's, I guess, benefits coming in from the budget. We've seen some fiscal measures being put in place, but a lot more cash allocation, cash allotment, as well as rebates in terms of cash incentives being introduced, specifically targeting the B40 and M40 group. Do you feel that more cash allocations such as this, in fact, to be frank, this is budget number 3 or number 4. There have been mini budgets that have been introduced by Tengku Zafrul along the way, along the years, along this year. The Prihatin budget, the Laksana programs that are currently being carried out. Do you feel that some of the allocations that have been given to the Rakyat in terms of tax allocation 1%, increasing excise duty for cigarettes, for instance, by 10%, those kind of stuff, it could actually help and navigate people manage their wallet better in the months to come?
Yeah, so obviously whatever money that can be distributed to the people will help. So I think the Bantuan Prihatin Negara, so that's that will help. I think up to 1,800 ringgit for a family with a few children, and the tax reduction for income bands between 50,000 and 70,000, for example. So that will help, although that will only amount to about 200 ringgit.
200 ringgit, yeah,
but,
if you're on the 70,000.
Yeah, every single ringgit will count. And the idea would be to put more money in people's pockets so that they can actually spend and help revive the economy in some ways. So I guess can more things be done if you have more resources, perhaps, but I guess really overstretching our resources, right? So, and I think even at 5.4% deficit, that's already quite large.
The dilemma that the finance minister and this government has to face is diametrically opposed, the ideas. We want the Rakyat to have enough savings to go on, but at the same time, in order for us to improve on the domestic consumption, we want Rakyat to spend. And asking people to do two things at the same time is actually quite problematic. You're asking the person to press the gas and press the brake at the same time.
Well, we're talking about different people in different circumstances, right? So
yeah.
I think the idea would be to always spend within your means.
Yeah.
So I think there are some of us who are not affected, especially those who are salaried people and where the company is still strong and able to pay decent salaries and so on. So I think the idea would be for these people, please continue to spend, but within your means. But for those who have very little left, obviously they have to optimize their income, and those with the income from whatever handout, so that would be the one that they will be spending.
Okay, we'll take a short break. When we continue later on, we'll ask Tan Sri Wahid about the capital markets as well as the FDI and the foreign investor approach that will be coming into the country for towards the end of the year as well as next year. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying on with us. FDI, of course, is a big deal for us to be discussing. So I have with me Tan Sri Wahid, the Chairman of Bursa Malaysia, talking about the budget as well as what the government's efforts are and perhaps the private sector on how they try to attract the investors. We've seen how the foreign outflows have been steady for the past few years. It's been going out. But that is a global trend. And we are faced against our competitors, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore. It's a very tough market to be in, a very lucrative market, albeit, but it's a very tough environment to be in right now. Do you feel that investors right now are quite excited to enter the private sector quite excited to enter the capital market space when we talk about Malaysia for 2021. What's your opinion on that?
Well, we're talking about two different things here. One is FDI, the other one is actually funds flow into the capital market. For FDI, the economy has now been mainly driven by private investments as opposed to public investments. And within that, the private investments is about 70% FDI. Sorry, it's about 70% domestic and 30% FDI. So the idea would be to not just focus on FDI, but to also focus on domestic direct investment as well. So I think in that context, the role of MIDA, together with all the agencies, will have to be better coordinated and more targeted, I would say, in terms of which industry and even which country the investors would originate from. In respect of the capital market, naturally, they move from one market to another. When there's a crisis, typically there's a movement back to safety, so to speak, away from emerging markets. But as things recover in 2021, typically we can expect some of these monies coming back to emerging markets. So for the Malaysian capital market this year, we have seen some 23 billion ringgit foreign investors fleeing the market, so to speak. But we are fortunate in the sense that that slack is taken up by local retail investors. There's about 12 billion ringgit, and then another 11 billion ringgit by our domestic institutional investors. So I think we are fortunate there is such a domestic liquidity to absorb that slack. But to me, at the end of the day, as the broader economy recovers, as our listed issuers, our companies perform better in 2021 relative to 2020, the investors will come back eventually.
Speaking about listed equities right now, one sector has been doing fairly well, tremendously well, and there were talks that there would be some sort of windfall tax. And while we saw a 400 million contribution from 4 rubber maker companies, glove making companies, it is a pseudo windfall tax, as I would call it. I always look at the effect rather than the form. And this is something that has been debated about during the budget night, but that seems to be, left unattended over the past few days. But kudos to that particular sector. But other sectors might seem troubled by this year's corporate income earnings, and it probably might need some time for them to recover. And because of this, do you feel that what would be some of the messages that you have for investors looking at other sectors, not just the super abnormal one, but all the other sectors within the listed Bursa Malaysia? We're looking at construction, we're looking at technology, we're looking at semiconductor, we're looking at all this other stuff, retail. What would be some of the ideas that you want to share with investors right now when they try to assess which sector to enter and invest in?
Right. Ibrahim, if I may, in the first place, during times when governments need more revenue, a typical approach would be to look at whether there are taxes that can be raised. So the fact remains that there's no increase in taxes generally. So that's a good start for the corporate sector. And specific to industries like the glove makers, for example, there have been calls for windfall tax to be imposed on them, just like what we did for the IPPs and for the oil palm sector previously. But I guess they were fortunate that with that 400 million ringgit contribution, they've been spared with the windfall tax. I think in the scheme of things, if you look at the profit estimation of most research houses, 400 million ringgit represents less than 2% of the total profits expected. So I think it's a good outcome, I would say, for the glove makers. Whilst at the same time, the government does get some help of 400 million ringgit to help the relevant people affected by COVID-19. I think beyond glove makers, obviously the tech IT companies are major beneficiaries of the current environment. And as we move forward, as we roll out the broadband infrastructure with Jendela project, I would expect the telcos who are growing their digital business to benefit further in this environment. So I think my view is actually it's a difficult environment to begin with. Having a relatively neutral tax regime is certainly good news, I would say.
Yeah, definitely, because a little bit more rigid in the tax regime, we would see these corporates start to find other markets that would be a little bit more friendly to them. That's something that we have to really think twice. Sure. But let's look into the broader agenda right now that the government wants to build. We are facing, well, the budget is still the topic of the day, but we're also looking at the 12th Malaysia Plan that has going to be outlaying the 5-year roadmap for the country. Do you feel that this budget is preparing the country for a very robust, a very recovery-oriented 12th Malaysia Plan that is coming, well, expected to be coming first quarter next year?
Yeah, I'm sure between the Ministry of Finance and the EPU, there have been many discussions about how to position the budget vis-a-vis the 12th Malaysia Plan that's coming up. And naturally, the priority will be to deal with the problems now, and therefore the priorities under the 2021 budget. But at the same time, preparing for the 5-year plan. And I would say that Budget 2021 is basically the first year of the 12th Malaysia Plan.
Effectively, yeah.
So I think we should expect more medium-term and long-term measures being announced under the 12th Malaysia Plan.
Some of the constrictions that the government is facing is, of course, debt to GDP ratio. Very recently, the government sought approval from the Parliament to raise it from 55% to 60%. That has been approved. But a lot of estimates coming in from all the research houses argue considerably that that 60% is actually nearing to be met or have surpassed that even. And because of that, it restricts the government from borrowing more, it restricts the government from trying to source for more funds. Do you feel that this is a concern that the government has to address?
Yeah, I think priority would be to do whatever it takes to get the economy started and growing. And given the slack in some of the private sector investments, so the government will typically will have to step in and pump prime the economy. And the other would be, if your revenue is not there, I don't think any government can avoid from going to the market to borrow. And I think in terms of the debt to GDP level, again, given the unprecedented situation, not just in Malaysia, but across the globe, I think generally people do expect governments to take up more borrowings in order to fund the economy.
So see, you touched a very important point there. Governments around the world are facing through similar problems like we are right now. It is a global pandemic crisis, it is a global health crisis, and therefore it is a global economic crisis. One is correlating to the other, and one is causing the other as well. Which begs the question of how do you make yourself a little bit more, how would Malaysia make ourselves a little bit more resilient in terms of other markets that are going through the same problem that we are going through right now? One of them is, of course, reducing risk. The elephant in the room that we haven't touched so far in this interview is, of course, political risk or government risk. Something that while agnostic investors come and go, as fair weather friends would, one thing that they are very cognizant about is the rising political risk that is currently happening in the country, or is currently happening in the country. What is your view on the current political risk of the country right now?
Yeah, before I answer that, if I may, Ibrahim, Malaysia has always adopted this policy of diversity in terms of the structure of the economy, in terms of the markets that we trade with, so that we will not be over-dependent on any particular industry or country or commodities for that matter. And I think over time, yes, we'll be impacted, but at least because we have multiple sources based on that diversification strategy, the impact will be less compared to a situation where if we have a certain over-concentration towards any particular sector or country or economy. sector of the economy.
Yeah.
In case of the political risk, obviously this is a new period that we're going through. But I guess we will have to take it in our stride. And the other would be after, with the call for unity currently for all parties to support the budget and get the economy going for the moment. One thing stabilize, go back to the people for elections. And I think as long as things are done in an orderly manner, I think people will not be overly concerned in that respect. And I think one thing which we all fortunate in the sense that where Malaysia is different from many other countries, notwithstanding the change in government back in 2018, and notwithstanding the change again in government in March this year, things remain peaceful. So you don't see.
It can get very violent on Facebook, though. But yes, I see what you mean.
I think generally people are civilized. There's no, no riots, nothing on the streets and so on. And I think, alhamdulillah, and I think that's something which we should be thankful for in that sense.
No, absolutely. People tend to forget that change of government does bring about, while there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets, there is calmness on the streets, which brings about that last and final point of how do you feel COVID-19 is going to be resolved. I know this, wearing your chairman hat of Bursa, but I mean, as a regular rakyat, we've seen some news of some vaccine trials doing well. Also, some companies might benefit a lot if they do get themselves FDA approved and market their vaccines out into the various markets. Malaysia is already white flagging ourselves. We are ready to accept trial vaccine right now. How do you feel this will pan out, in your opinion?
Well, the good thing is that there are many initiatives and vaccines which are at the stage 3 level. And it is our hope that we'll not be relying on only one source for the vaccines. So as we have multiple vaccines available in the market, and that will become more accessible to all countries in the world. Even as we speak, I think I'm just reading some report that the one announced by Pfizer, for example, apparently they're able to produce 50 million portions for this year, and 10 million supposedly earmarked for UK and another 40 million for US, and therefore not very much left for other countries for this year. But I think as we get more and more producers coming out with more reliable vaccines, and some of them will actually get our way. And vaccine is obviously one major part of the solution, but pending the arrival of the vaccine, I think it's very important for us to continue to contain the spread of the virus and try to come up with a very balanced approach. Because you've seen how national lockdowns can cripple the economy significantly. So if you look at the second quarter, we saw the 17.1% decline in GDP. And alhamdulillah, things recovered in the third quarter. We'll know the figure at the end of this week. But as we get into the lockdown in November and December, I fear that the impact will be quite severe. So I think it's important for us over the next few weeks to come up with a more targeted solution so that we can help to some extent revive the economy. I was at a hotel yesterday at lunchtime, and unfortunately, I was having a meeting with someone. We were the only patron.
You have a whole hotel to yourselves.
Yeah, from 12 to 1:30 at that point in time. So I don't think we can continue like this for too long. So we do need to get the economy moving so that businesses can stay afloat and people can continue to be employed.
What are your final thoughts on all this?
Well, in the first place, perhaps for us at Bursa, we've been fortunate because with the current crisis, we've been able to get many investors coming on board. We've seen how in the first 9 months our average daily value increase double from just under 2 billion ringgit per day to 4 billion ringgit. And alhamdulillah, that's hopefully continuing. We've been wanting to get more retail investors into the market. Alhamdulillah, they are now on board. We've been wanting to get more online broking. So alhamdulillah, again, about 45% of trades are now done online. And that's resulted in our market staying relatively resilient. And for Bursa, as a public listed company, also generating reasonable returns for our investors. So I think as we move forward, the challenge will be how to make it sustainable. And we believe that with all the measures, the advocacy that we're doing to the public, and with our public listed companies continuing to perform, one day we believe that other investors will come back. So it is important for us to remain focused, do what we can within our circle of influence, be positive, be constructive, and I think inshallah Malaysia will continue to grow, notwithstanding the challenging circumstances.
Fantastic. What a way to end. That was our conversation with Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar, the chairman of Bursa Malaysia. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to Asrawani. Look for Notepad over there. There's plenty of interviews like this that can be found there. Also, this interview is available at Bursa Malaysia. Go to their websites as well as their resources to find out more about these kind of advocacy programs for investors there as well. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.